Throughout the Cold War, British air bases on Cyprus were a vital and very busy source of power projection for the UK and US in the Mediterranean. They also played a part in the conflicts between Greece and Turkey over the island, in the Arab-Israeli conflicts, the Suez Crisis, Beirut, and in the nuclear deterrent against the Soviet Union. I therefore thought that it was worth setting out the background of air operations on the island, its tactical and its strategic role, and of course the many interesting types of aircraft that operated from Cyprus before and during the Cold War. Before getting to air operations, it's useful to understand the history of British military involvement in the island. Great Britain somewhat reluctantly found itself occupying Cyprus in 1878. The Ottoman Empire had already tried twice before to exchange a lease of the island for a guarantee of Britain defending them against the Russians, when their offer was finally accepted at the third attempt. The Cyprus Convention was signed on the 4th of June, 1878. 10,000 British troops landed on the island, but they very soon discovered that the hot climate was inhospitable to the average British or imperial soldier. Cyprus's agricultural infrastructure was also totally incapable of sustaining such a large force. Within a couple of months, all of the Indian troops had returned to the subcontinent. By May 1879, only 400 troops remained on the island. Having now demonstrated the folly of camping on the coast, the garrison erected a new camp in the Troodos Mountains in the west of the island. This tactic of mountain camps or hill forts had been developed in India, and it worked well to lessen the effects of the heat during the summer months. The more pleasant conditions made the Troodos camp useful as a place for soldiers to convalesce during the sweltering Egyptian campaign of 1882. It remains in use today. The First World War found Britain and the Ottoman Empire on opposite sides. The British garrison forces promptly annexed the island. Despite its proximity to Turkey, the Ottomans never mounted a counter-invasion. Constantinople had too many other problems. First, it was flat broke. Second, many of its citizens, such as the Armenians, didn't support the war, so the Sultan found himself fighting off enemies on no less than 5 fronts as well as at home. He was fighting the British in Egypt and Mesopotamia. The Russians invaded the Caucasus. The Anglo-French landings then happened in Gallipoli. And there were desert Arabs rising up in what is today Saudi Arabia. The British authorities were always concerned that the Turkish Cypriots might turn against the British, though. Listening stations were set up to spy on Turkish radio messages, and spies and saboteurs were smuggled into Turkey. Its relatively high level of security meant that Cyprus was used as a convalescent home for thousands of sick and wounded British soldiers from the Middle East campaigns. It also became a secure place to hold the thousands of Turkish prisoners of war that were captured. The island was on a martial footing throughout the war, and various civilian governors had to fight off attempts by the army to take over the administration. Britain also attempted to trade Cyprus to Greece in 1916 as a bribe for a declaration of war on the Ottomans and the Central Powers. To the amazement of the Greek Cypriots, this offer was turned down. The lack of military action, the island's distant location, and the short range of contemporary aircraft meant that only limited attempts were made to establish an airfield or to deploy seaplane tenders to Cyprus during the Great War. The seaplane carrier Empress visited the island twice during the conflict, but I've not found evidence of other tenders deploying there. A pair of German DFW C-5 aircraft did make some reconnaissance flights over the island in late 1917 and into the spring of 1918, and apparently they encountered no resistance. 8 years later, in November 1926, the experienced diplomat Sir Ronald Storrs became governor of Cyprus. He was shocked to find that no aircraft had visited there since the end of the war. In early 1927, he therefore began lobbying Imperial Airways to substitute Nicosia for Alexandria as one of their refueling stops on their eastern route, and established an emergency landing ground outside the city. Sir Ronald rapidly became the air bore to the Colonial Office and the Cyprus bore to the Air Ministry and Imperial Airways. While he was doing this, he had the landing field at Nicosia improved. In this case, improved meant making a dirt track slightly less dirty. There was now a telephone there as well, but no drainage, so if there was any rain, the field almost immediately became too boggy to use. The RAF were persuaded to inspect the facilities in March 1930, a visit that caused great interest as it brought a Ferry 3F at the back, and I think a Hawker Hornbill at the front of the island. Vickers Victories began to fly supply missions at around this time. Security was the opposite of tight, and locals were able to get up close and personal with the RAF's latest machines during their visits to Nicosia. Fixed infrastructure at the airport remained limited, though. You can see the rudimentary fueling arrangements in this picture of a civilian DH-86 during the middle 1930s. These were part of a regular weekly service, initially from Cairo via Palestine, and then as a stop on the journey from Baghdad to Cairo. Civilian short Kent flying boats from Imperial Airways also regularly stopped at Limassol in the 1930s on their way from India to the UK. These would have fueled from a lighter with passengers ferried off by small boat. The picture is not one of coordinated building up of aviation handling facilities on the island, as happened on Malta in the same period. It was an energetic effort by local business people and aviation enthusiasts in the military. With war on the horizon, civilian services to Nicosia ended in 1938. At that same time, a modest military aviation buildup began. Shortly after the outbreak of war in October 1939, the building of 3 all-weather runways began, construction of which was completed by May 1940. Facilities were still very limited, and most of the accommodation was still intense. The first RAF personnel to occupy the new RAF Nicosia was a radio unit, whose purpose, other than to report aircraft movements at Nicosia, was to warn the British forces in Egypt and Palestine about enemy aircraft that might be flying their way. The island was attacked for the first time on 22 September 1940, when Italian bombers attacked the mining facilities at Zeros on the north coast. A single Bristol Blenheim was deployed to Nicosia to deter these attacks, but it only stayed for 4 days before returning to Egypt. In the spring of 1941, half a dozen Swordfish torpedo bombers were deployed to the island to enforce the blockade of the Vichy French colonies in Lebanon and Syria. 2 Curtiss Tomahawks and later 6 Hurricanes provided local air defense. In response to the Paris Protocols, which granted Germany access to military facilities in Vichy-controlled Syria, Britain invaded Lebanon and Syria on June 8, 1941. In response, on 11 June, the large destroyer Chevalier Paul set off to carry ammunition for the French ships based in Beirut. Admiral Darlan had requested permission from the Germans and Italians to do so via radio message, which the British decoded. They were therefore alerted to the ship's mission and route. Chevalier Paul passed the Greek island of Castellarizo on 15 June, and hugging the coast of Turkey, it tried to avoid detection or interception by British forces on Cyprus. A British reconnaissance aircraft found her, though, at 6:15 in the evening of 15 June. The 6 Swordfish of 815 Naval Air Squadron attacked her 50 nautical miles off the Syrian coast at 3 o'clock the next morning, and they torpedoed her. One of the Swordfish was shot down in the process. Chevalier Paul radioed for help, and the Vichy French destroyers Valmy and Gepard departed Beirut an hour later to come to her aid. They were almost immediately intercepted by the New Zealand light cruiser Leander and the destroyers HMS Jervis and HMS Kimberley, and they were forced to retire to Beirut. After French aircraft then drove off the Allied ships, Valmy and Gepard again set off to assist Chevalier Paul, but they were too late. These ships sank at 6:45 in the morning off the coast of Syria. Valmy and Gepard rescued all but 7 of her crew and that of the downed Swordfish. Once Vichy forces surrendered in September 1941, Cyprus once again returned to being an aviation backwater for a good 18 months. Local efforts to improve facilities did, however, continue, using every piece of heavy plant that the island had to offer. By 1943, 7 tarmac and 1 compressed earth airstrip had been completed. Nicosia received the most significant program of upgrades. The tented camps were replaced by solid buildings, tarmac taxiways were laid joining the ends of the 3 runways, 2 of which were extended, and new hard standings were constructed. Sunken fighter pens and 2 protected pens for bombers were also built. Winston Churchill himself visited aboard his converted Liberator, named Commando in January 1943, to meet with local politicians. In September 1943, Britain embarked on an operation aimed at recapturing the Dodecanese Islands in the Aegean. Air support for the operation was supposed to be provided by aircraft based on Cyprus. This immediately created a problem because the islands were 250 miles away, and the only available aircraft were Hurricanes and Bow fighters which were based at Lusitania. The High Command had asked Eisenhower to release P-38 Lightning squadrons from North Africa, but this request was denied as those aircraft were needed over Italy. Bow fighters did have the range to reach the islands, but they weren't really ideal for any of the required missions besides interdiction of coastal shipping. They did successfully strike a number of Axis convoys, but unfortunately the transports they sunk were carrying Italian POWs, thousands of whom were killed. The RAF were initially able to deploy a handful of Spitfires to the airfield on Kos, which remained in Italian hands after their capitulation. They also attempted to deploy a handful of floatplane Spitfires supported by a Walrus amphibian, but preparations took too long. Kos airfield came under sustained attack by the Luftwaffe shortly thereafter, and the island was taken in an amphibious assault in early October. This weakened the ability of the RAF to hold on to air superiority, and the campaign wound down into an Allied defeat that cost them 3 destroyers and 115 aircraft. Air forces on Cyprus then became part of the RAF Mediterranean and Middle East Command, or MEDME, in December 1943. A new control tower and regional operational training unit were established in 1944 as Cyprus facilities continued to expand. Its lack of proximity to fighting was a useful attribute, although the end of the war meant that the OTU was disbanded in spring 1945. 256 Squadron Flying Mosquitoes was the only permanent combat squadron based at Nicosia in the immediate post-war period. In support, Spitfires operated by No. 6 Squadron periodically based themselves at Nicosia as part of their roaming existence around the theater. They upgraded to Hawker Tempests in December 1946, and then to de Havilland Vampires in 1951 and Venoms in 1954. I'll keep mention of those types to a minimum as every time I make a video on them it bombs. From 1952 to 1955, No. 14 Squadron from the New Zealand Air Force also flew Vampires from Nicosia. There were no night fighters, interceptors, or bombers stationed on the island in this period. Just so you can keep track of organizations, MEDME had become the Middle East Air Force in June 1949. Things began to change in April 1955 when the UK signed the Baghdad Pact mutual defense with Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, and Turkey. This led to the formation of the Central Treaty Organization, or CENTO, which was intended to ward off Soviet aggression, although it has the sour taste of late imperialism in it too. With the Soviets now definitely nuclear armed, the question of how to provide a deterrent shield to the participants came into stark focus. Conveniently, the new RAF airfield at Akrotiri, in what had become one of the sovereign base areas in Cyprus, was approaching completion and was ideally positioned to accommodate a substantial resident air force. So in July 1956, the Chiefs of Staff approved the provision of 4 Canberra light bomber squadrons, 1 photographic reconnaissance squadron flying the Canberra PR-7, some maritime support aircraft. In April 1956, the Fleet Air Arm began anti-smuggling operations from Nicosia, initially using 3 Gannet AS-1 aircraft from 847 Naval Air Squadron. The aircraft were deployed until 1959, with 2 being lost in accidents and 1 crew of 3 being killed. The Gannets were, however, very effective, and they even detected several incoming light aircraft on supply runs. RAF fighters were vectored to intercept, but they never received orders to fire. The Canberra squadrons had previously been flying the Venom and had been based in other parts of the region, but the Venom lacked range to be effective, and a conversion was needed for them. With a combat radius approaching 1,000 miles, the Canberras could reach far across the region, or they could ferry to bases within range of the Soviet heartlands. At this stage, the aircraft were armed with conventional bombs. Each could carry 6 1,000-pounders. For the next 4 years, any nuclear requirement was provided by flying aircraft and weapons direct from the United Kingdom. No. 13 Squadron was the first to arrive. They had been previously based in Egypt, and it was only a matter of months before they were back in action over that country. Several aircraft sustained damage due to enemy fire, and 1 was lost. On the 6th of November 1956, the last day of the Suez campaign, Canberra WH-799 took off from Akrotiri for a photo wreck sortie. The purpose of the mission was to monitor a reported buildup of Soviet-supplied combat aircraft in Syria. Unfortunately, the aircraft was shot down by a Syrian Air Force Meteor F-8. Cyprus was an essential part of the air campaign over Suez. Large numbers of tactical aircraft started arriving on the island in August 1956, until the airfields were clogged with different fighters and bombers. By late October, there were no less than 112 combat aircraft at Akrotiri, 127 at Nicosia, and 46 at Timbu. These included 2 squadrons of brand new Hawker Hunter F Mark I interceptors, one of Meteor NF-13 night fighters, 3 squadrons of Venoms totaling 36 aircraft, as well as 60 French F-84FS and 16 RF-84FS. The Venom fighter bombers would be heavily employed in suppressing Egyptian flak during the campaign. Towards the end of the war, one of the French RF-84FS would be lost in a fatigue-induced operational accident. So bad were the traffic jams at Akrotiri that the RAF had to withdraw their FR-9s back to Malta, just before the war began to try and reduce contention for the runways and other facilities. Jammed in amongst these purely tactical types were No. 13 Squadron's older and shorter-legged Canberras, which were mainly tasked with marking targets for Vickers Valiant and more Canberra bombers which were based on Malta. While Akrotiri, whose main runway had only recently been completed, was mainly a base for fighter, photo, recon, and ground attack aircraft, Nicosia was mainly used for troop transport and supplies. Early on the 5th of November 1956, the 3rd Battalion Parachute Regiment boarded their aircraft at the base and headed for Egypt. 3 companies and their supplies were airlifted from Nicosia aboard 26 Hastings and Velettas, protected by RAF fighters and ground attack aircraft. Their missions were successful, but the war was a disaster. After the Suez debacle, Britain became rather less interested in the strategic value of Cyprus for a time, but that did not stop the volume of air operations growing. Squadrons assigned to the island performed 3 main missions. First, there were the bombers, fundamental to the deterrent role that Britain had promised its allies, whether in the Middle East or to the West. At the other end of the spectrum were the counterinsurgency missions, aimed at impeding and even interdicting the operations of the EOKA terrorists. Somewhere in between were the fighter squadrons tasked with local and area defense. Although the day fighter squadrons left almost as soon as the war was over, 39 Squadron had moved its Meteor NF night fighters to Cyprus in August 1956, and they remained there after the end of hostilities in case the political situation in Lebanon deteriorated. The squadron was disbanded on June 30, 1958, with its number taken over by 69 Squadron, which flew the Canberra PR-9. Hunter Day fighter squadrons from other postings rotated through Akrotiri to fill the gap. With a combat radius of well under 200 nautical miles, the Hunter lacked enough range to be useful for anything other than point defense, though. But as the Lightning began to replace the Gloucester Javelin on the UK mainland, a squadron of Javelins could be permanently stationed on Cyprus, a posting they fulfilled between 1963 and 1967. Although relatively stately, the Javelin had over 500 nautical miles of combat radius, more if it had tanks. They often operated in very tense circumstances, intercepting Turkish aircraft penetrating Cypriot airspace. Egyptian aircraft were intercepted on similar probes once or twice, and Javelins also occasionally escorted Soviet bombers and patrol aircraft flying over the eastern Mediterranean. The Javelins were required to defend the new addition to the RAF's arsenal on Cyprus. In 1956, when plans were being laid to develop Akrotiri as a forward base for V-bomber detachments and a permanent home for Canberras, they included provision for nuclear weapons storage. However, it was the early 1960s before Britain's commitments to the Baghdad Pact led to permanent deployment of nuclear weapons at Akrotiri, a development which implied a significant change of role for the resident Canberra squadrons. As in the Far East, British planners saw nuclear weapons as the most cost-effective way of contributing to Allied defense of the region. It was thought that the weapons would only be used in a global war between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies. The risk of escalation if limited nuclear war were to break out in the Middle East would be far too great to plan for any such conflict. It's also worth noting that the British Chiefs of Staff rejected advice in a 1956 report, not long before the Suez Crisis, that nuclear weapons should be employed in a limited war against Egypt. By 1960, when Cyprus was granted independence from Britain, facilities were available for 16 Redbeards to be brought to Akrotiri in a crisis and stored temporarily there. On 28 November 1961, a permanent facility, the Supplementary Storage Area, or SSA, at nearby Cape Gatter became available to hold 32 Redbeards. These 15-kiloton weapons weighed 1,950 pounds apiece, and each Canberra could carry one in its bomb bay. 2 RAF regiment squadrons defended that installation as part of their protection of the base. Because of the post-independence SBAs, Akrotiri and Cape Gatter were technically on British soil. However, this did not eliminate political sensitivities, as the Cypriot government under Archbishop Makarios was neither especially pro-British nor a member of CENTO. A British Air Ministry official wrote in 1960 that all possible measures should be taken in Cyprus to conceal the arrival and storage of nuclear bombs, whether they be inert, drill, or the real McCoy. A few years later, a plan of Akrotiri was published in a local newspaper, but luckily the SSA was identified as soldiers' and sailors' accommodation. The arrival of Canberra B-15s and 16s in 1961 gave the Akrotiri squadrons a nuclear role, which was implicit in their new collective title of the Akrotiri Strike Wing. Both versions were modified B-6 airframes, strengthened for low-level operations in general, but particularly for the nuclear delivery maneuver associated with the low-altitude bombing system, or LABS. Re-equipment of all 4 squadrons with B-15s and 16s was completed in early 1963, and it marked the start of the period during which the Cyprus wing possessed its greatest combat potential. As well as its nuclear strike capabilities, the Canberra offered a wide range of conventional attack options, employing medium-level 1,000-pound bombs, shallow dive bombing, and low-level rocketing. 249 Squadron also had a target marking role using 4.5-inch parachute flares and target indicators. Regular weapons training took place at practice ranges at Episkopi Bay and Larnaca using 25-pound practice bombs. Rocketry could also be practiced at Larnaca. If pilots wanted to drop full-fat 1,000-pounders, then they needed to fly to the El Adem range in Libya. In 1965, the French AS-30 radio-guided missile was added to the Canberra's arsenal as well. But by that time, the type's retirement was fast approaching. Global nuclear geopolitics aside, this was a turbulent period in Cyprus. Terrorist activity perpetrated by both sides had been a feature on the island since the war. British bases were targeted alongside the people of both communities. Oster AOP-6 and Bristol Sycamore helicopters had been based at Nicosia to observe and enable interdiction of the terrorist supply lines, but their patrols were of limited effectiveness in the rugged terrain. From time to time, they were joined by flights of Meteor FR Mark 9s. On 10 November 1956, a Hawker Hunter from one squadron was damaged beyond repair by an EOKA time bomb that was either attached to the undercarriage leg or concealed within the wheel well. A much more damaging attack happened at Akrotiri on the night of November 24, 1957. Bombs were planted on Canberras in one of the hangars at the base. When they exploded, they destroyed 4 of the bombers and a Venom fighter, as well as destroying the hangar itself. A year later, in November 1958, a bomb exploded in the Nafi Nicosia airport, which killed 2 men and seriously injured a further 7. This caused the dismissal of a large number of Greek Cypriots employed on the base. In response, the RAF brought in 5 Chipmunks to fly counterinsurgency patrols alongside the Sycamores and Ostro, but they proved unsuitable, and the unit was disbanded in March 1959. The terrorist threat didn't prevent Cyprus becoming the command center for the Near East Air Force, or NEAF, in 1961, though. But in 1964, the simmering pot got perilously close to boiling over. English Electric Lightning squadrons had started to deploy to Cyprus in about 1962, and they were present when a series of armed clashes between the Turkish and Greek communities flared up in late 1963 and 1964. The Lightnings were primarily on the island to strengthen defenses around the nuclear weapons storage facilities. In this role, they worked with Bloodhound SAM batteries and a large Mark 84 radar at Mount Olympus near Nicosia. The Mark 84 fed its information to 280 Signals unit, conveniently located next to Akrotiri Airfield. There was a Type 254 radar there with associated height finders, complementing the excellent vantage point that the Olympus site had for detecting low-flying targets. In combination with radar-directed L-7 Bofors anti-aircraft guns at Akrotiri, the British bases had a strong and multi-layered air defense system. By 1964, little happened in the vicinity of Cyprus without the RAF knowing about it. There was, however, rarely the political will to take action. As the 1964 crisis escalated, Greek Air F-84s began to overfly the island and the British bases. Not willing to accept that, Lightnings intercepted the Greek formations, using their vastly superior performance to sidle up onto the Greek 6 o'clock positions. If this didn't deter them, then the Lightning crews executed supersonic flybys, shaking the recon jets around in their wake and spoiling their photos. The Greeks weren't to know that the Lightnings were unarmed, and they were under strict instructions not to open fire. Lightnings also attempted to break up Greek Cypriot attacks on Turkish communities. If tensions were about to break in a particular village, then the Lightnings would be called in to wire the area, which they did with a low-level supersonic pass and afterburner, producing a level of noise previously unknown in Cyprus. Sometimes this either impressed or scared the locals into simmering down, but sadly it was far too little to prevent the atrocities of 1964. The Lightnings became a permanent fixture in 1967, replacing the Javelins. The airbase at Nicosia had been closed in '66 to simplify security arrangements. Akrotiri became exceptionally busy, with a steady stream of VC-10s and Britannias passing through it and making the base one of the busiest in the RAF. In June of 1967, the Six-Day War then erupted. As Sir David Lee puts it in his authoritative history, Wings in the Sun, neither Cyprus nor the RAF was involved in the short but fierce conflict, but it served to maintain the tension and instability that was never absent in the Near East. It was one good reason for maintaining the air defenses of the island and the SBAs in particular, as there was no guarantee that the ramifications of the conflict would not spill over and affect Cyprus. The dozen or so Lightning pilots spent most of the six-day conflict at cockpit alert. Temperatures were well into the 30s, and there was no cover for the aircraft other than a locally made cloth canopy which regularly blew away when the wind got up, as it always did in the afternoon. One of the RAF's lessons from the conflict was therefore that it was not feasible to maintain that kind of alert for more than a few days without running real flight safety risks. Incidentally, the Lightning squadrons were ordered to provide copies of their logbooks to higher-ups in London, because the Egyptians refused to believe that the Israelis had not had help in executing their attacks. Air defense of Cyprus might seem to have been an easy assignment, but that was not the prevailing view in the day. The overwhelming belief was that nuclear war was not only possible but likely. Britain had, after all, drawn down large portions of its armed forces because of a nuclear-first strategy. Unlike the Javelin, which had a cannon and 4 Firestreak air-to-air missiles, the Lightning F-3 was armed only with 2 Red Top missiles. The Red Top did provide a head-on capability and a much better angle off than the Firestreak, but having only 2 untested missiles and no backup meant that a large raid would be hard to defend against. There would have been leakers for the Bloodhounds to deal with. Lightning squadrons were at least able to practice against the resident Canberra and later the Vulcan squadrons on Cyprus, though. They were generally at a very high state of readiness, with the squadrons operating in much the same way as those in the UK. Facilities were, however, still rather more rudimentary. 10-minute quick reaction alert was conducted from wooden huts near the taxiway, with the armed aircraft parked in the open facing in a safe direction towards the Akrotiri Lake. Only major servicing was carried out under cover. All other servicing was on the dispersal, and often in temperatures rising above 35 Celsius. Ground crew therefore worked in difficult physical circumstances. The squadrons were also on the end of the Lightning supply chain, and spare parts were thus in short supply at times. Some aircraft ended up being cannibalized to keep the others going, a reflection of how the British economy was in this period as well. There were regular scrambles. The Soviets were not disinterested in the SBA, as evident from the regular diversions from track of Russian airliners and military transports en route to Egypt. It was a period in which the Soviets were supplying Egypt with a great deal of weapons, a process that continued up to and during the 1973 war. So there were many excuses to attempt a little look at one of the nuclear bases on its southern flank. Egyptian and American aircraft from the 6th Fleet also regularly strayed into the Cyprus air defense zone. Apparently, the U.S. Navy either didn't know or didn't care about intruding on the security of a NATO ally's nuclear weapons facilities. Like some other parts of Britain's colonial legacy, Akrotiri did end up proving quite important to the U.S., in this case for monitoring the situation in the Middle East. U.S. operations at Akrotiri date back to August 1970 in the Israeli-Egyptian War of Attrition that followed the Six-Day War. To try and avert full-scale war as part of the ceasefire agreement, the U.S. government rapidly sent 2 CIA UTWARs to Akrotiri. Between then and November, they completed 29 SIGINT and photographic missions before they were withdrawn. After the ceasefire that followed the October 1973 war, the Syrian, Egyptian, and Israeli governments again agreed to U-2 overflights of the recent combat areas to confirm the removal of forces from designated disengagement zones. Unusually, in this case the U-2's presence was made public. In late April 1974, a CIA U-2 arrived at the Cypriot base, and between 12 May and 28 July it conducted 6 overflights of the disengagement areas. Responsibility for the mission and possession of the remaining UTWARS were handed over to the USAF on 1 August 1974. Under their ownership, the monitoring operation became known as Olive Harvest, a mission that continues to this day. There was also a secretive parallel signals intelligence operation called Olive Tree that deepened the USAF's understanding of the capabilities of the various militaries in the region. The price for use of Akrotiri for this was sharing all of the intelligence that was gathered with the British. The Lightning squadrons were tasked to defend this combination of nuclear strike and high-end intelligence gathering capabilities 247 and whatever the weather. Now the Lightning was an all-weather fighter, but low-level air defense at night was particularly challenging for its pilots. The Mediterranean after sunset is pretty dark. There are no lights in sight. To make matters worse, the pressure error for the altimeter at high speed was more than 300 feet at low level. That 300-foot error bar in the altimeter would be a lethal problem in practice. If a pilot was chasing a Navy Buccaneer at 500 knots on the deck, then because the Mark 23 radar was a pulse rather than a pulse Doppler set, the technique he was supposed to use for the intercept involved closing on the target a few hundred feet above it, and then bunting down until the red top missile acquired. I'm not sure I'd want to do that if the target was flying at 50 feet, and the error in the altimeter was 300 feet, and I couldn't see anything. There were many occasions when the weather reduced the performance of 280 signal units' various radars, and this, coupled with the air intercept Mark 23 radar's weaknesses at low level, caused some thought to be given to employing the Bloodhound rather than the Lightning as the first line of defense for low-level attackers. The 1970s brought with them a doctrinal shift in the RAF and NATO. Massive retaliation gave way to flexible response, which led to the end of nuclear-armed quick reaction alert for bomber crews. Slightly before this change, Cyprus 4 Canberra squadrons were replaced with 2 squadrons of the highly capable Avro Vulcan in 1969, built by Avro Vulcan in 1969. As well as being a more survivable nuclear strike aircraft, the Vulcan could deliver up to 21 1,000-pound bombs over long distances. The V-4 squadrons were also very advanced for the time in terms of their approaches to training. They were early and enthusiastic adopters of ground-based simulators to augment their flying and weapons delivery training. Although just 2 squadrons represented a small proportion of the overall force, the RAF accepted that they would have to accept the cost of shipping such a simulator to Cyprus so that the crews didn't have to constantly rotate back to the UK. Thus, practice war missions could be flown, which much improved the training and testing of critical crew cooperation, especially during the tense moments of attacking a heavily defended target. Actual mission training on Cyprus was, however, rather limited by geography. The island was small and the Vulcan was fast. The crews therefore went on a leisurely tour navigation cruise over to Crete before settling into a low-level route that culminated with a simulated nuclear strike on what is now the party town of Ayia Napa. It was then just a quiet fishing village. Lightnings would sometimes turn up on the route to practice interception, and conversely allow the Vulcans to practice evasion, the use of their jammers, and so on. One slight operational issue on Cyprus was that there was no obvious place to divert to if there was an issue at Akrotiri. The Lightnings were very short-lived birds, and they frequently needed priority access to the field with fuel emergencies, much to the annoyance of the Vulcan crews. Nicosia had an 8,000-foot runway, but if there was a weather or other issue there, it was off to Adna in Turkey or Suda Bay in Crete. The other option was to land on the Akrotiri taxiway. It was, however, only 60 feet wide. The Vulcan's wheel spacing was 32 feet, so precision flying would have been required. The weather at the base also represented as much of a challenge to the Vulcan crews as it did to those in the Lightnings. Sitting on alert or doing pre-flight checks in an enclosed metal tube with bright sunlight and a minimum 30-degree air temperature was very draining. Crews coped by using lightweight flying suits and even air-ventilated suits. Large cold air trolleys would blast freezing air into the aircraft while they did the startup checks, which usually took an hour, unless the aircraft had been primed for an alert. There was a rule that once the door was closed, crews had to be airborne within 15 minutes to avoid boiling. Once airborne, they would climb up high, get the cockpit really cold, and then descend into the low-level route for as long as they could stand it. Around the time of the Turkish invasion in 1974, the Vulcans were withdrawn. Phantoms were based at the airbase during the troubled summer and autumn of 1974. This one came a cropper on the island, but amazingly it flew again 2 years later. The role of Phantoms and Lightnings in those months was to monitor the ongoing conflict and to dissuade Turkish, or sometimes Greek aircraft, from entering the airspace around the nuclear weapons installations. Like the Lightnings, the Phantoms weren't permanent fixtures anymore, though. Instead, crews went out from Germany or the UK for training rotations to keep familiar with the base and its surroundings and take advantage of the various ranges and routes. Although the Lightning is much loved, in truth the range and magazine depth of the Phantom made it a far sturdier air defense option. Buccaneers also deployed to Akrotiri during the Beirut crisis of 1983. During September, they cooperated with the U.S. Navy operations in the area to fly the flag over the city. Flag flying or not, the Buccaneers were heavily armed. They carried laser-guided bombs, paved spike pods, ALQ-101 ECM pods, and AIM-9 air-to-air missiles under the wings. For backup, they also hauled 4 1,000-pound retarded bombs in the bomb bay. Some aircraft were also fitted with AL-40 chaff and flare dispensers to provide some protection against MA and PADS. Conceptually, at least, the Buccaneers would have provided protection against incoming artillery fire onto the flats occupied by British service personnel and diplomats by flattening the guns with their heavy bombs. Quite how realistic that was, given the lack of forward air control and the confusing situation on the ground, is unclear, but the firepower was there nonetheless. In the end, no strikes were required, although the French carrier Foch did launch a strike with 2 étendards. It had limited or more likely no effect. The Independence and John F. Kennedy battle groups, on the other hand, launched heavy strikes on Syrian forces in the Lebanon after the 23rd of October suicide attack on the Marine barracks in Beirut. U.S. surface ships also conducted occasional attack on the Marine barracks in Beirut. U.S. surface ships also conducted occasional shore bombardment fire missions, including several large and devastating ones from USS New Jersey that used up most of the 16-inch ammunition in the theater. Having been stood down, the Buccaneer crews took the opportunity to practice their core mission of maritime reconnaissance and strike. They were fortunate in that the new Soviet battlecruiser Kirov had entered the Mediterranean and was thus fair game for a little bit of practice. Airfield attacks against Akrotiri were also experimented with, taking advantage of the Buccaneers' legendary ability to fly only feet over the ground. That was about it for serious Cold War operations. Other than ongoing possession of Hong Kong, Britain had no further interests east of Suez. Transport flights were therefore not as frequent as they had been in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Akrotiri would play its role in the 1991 Gulf War, and it remains an important base to this day. But those operations are beyond the scope of the channel. Hopefully, this quick overview of air operations on Cyprus has given you a useful example of how Britain's imperial-era bases evolved to include air power, and then how they developed through the end of empire and into the Cold War nuclear standoff.